Thanks. We go now to the White House and President Trump's national security advisor, Robert O'Brien. Good morning to you, Ambassador.
Good morning, Margaret. Great to be here.
On Friday, Dr. Deborah Birx, your colleague, said that D.C. is the metro area with the highest positivity rate in the country. There's significant virus swirling here. Have all the G7 leaders agreed to come to Washington, and is it advisable to do that?
Well, the G7 summit, if it happens in person, and we think it will take place at the end of June. So I think we're getting very close to the peak, if we're not at the peak already in Washington. And if the situation permits it, and we think it will, we'd love to have the G7 in person. I think the G7 leaders would love to meet in person and not do a video conference. So the president extended the invitation, and so far we've had a great response. The logistics, we'll make sure everybody's tested. We'll make sure that it's a safe environment if the leaders can come here, but we'd love to host them in Washington.
So end of June, no longer June 10th for the G7?
No, I think we'd be looking at the end of June at this point, just because of the logistics of bringing in so many world leaders with their security details and planning for the event. So I think it would be later in June. But again, it's a chance for the leaders of the democracies, of the free enterprise countries to get together and decide how to get their economies reopened and how we can work together to make sure that we all come out of this COVID crisis and bring back health and peace and prosperity to our peoples.
We learned this week, because the president shared it, that he's been taking hydroxychloroquine along with zinc. He also mentioned he's been taking azithromycin. Is there a national security risk for the commander-in-chief to be taking a medication that the FDA warns the public there is risk of having heart problems? And are there other drugs that the president is taking?
Well, I'm not aware of any other drugs that the president's taking, but he's in close consultation with his physician, Commander Sean Connolly, a Navy physician who's an outstanding doctor, and I'm sure they're doing the right regimen for President Trump. I can tell you with the anti-malarial drugs, I've spent a lot of time in Africa over the years, and I've taken anti-malarial drugs with no side effects and no problems during that time. And so I think the president's under great medical care with Walter Reed and with Dr. Connolly here at the White House, and I think he's doing the right thing that he and his physician believe is good for the president. So I'm not concerned about his health. The guy has got more energy than anyone I've ever seen. He works 16, 18 hours a day, so I don't see any change in his strong performance as a result of whatever health regimen he's undergoing.
If you look around the world right now, Brazil has a spiking rate of infection from COVID-19. The southern hemisphere is an area we know Dr. Fauci said he's very worried about. Are you going to cut off travel from the southern hemisphere?
You know, we're concerned about the people of the southern hemisphere and certainly the people of Brazil. They're having a rough go of it. We've had a rough go of it. And one of the things I want to say, and just as I preface to responding to that question, which is a great question, I want the American people to know how much the president cares about them and the 90 to 91,000 people that have been lost: parents, grandparents, friends, first responders, frontline workers in the healthcare industry. We mourn their loss. And as far as travel to Brazil goes, and I'm sorry for the long intro to that, I think that we'll have a 212F decision today with respect to Brazil, and just like we did with the UK and Europe and China, and we hope that'll be temporary. But because of the situation in Brazil, we're going to take every step necessary to protect the American people.
So that sounds like you are looking to cut off travel from Brazil and the southern hemisphere.
As of now, I'd say Brazil, and we'll take a look at the other countries on a country-by-country basis for sure, Margaret.
I know travel from Europe to this country wasn't restricted until mid-March. China earlier. National Security Council has been reportedly pushing for travel from Europe to be cut off earlier than it was. Do you regret not being more aggressive in that?
Well, one of the things we did, and I think, again, a story that has not been focused on enough, is when we raised this issue really for the first time and really vehemently with President Trump on January 28th with respect to the China travel ban. Within 2 days, even though many of his advisors urged against it, the president made a hard decision and cut off travel from China within 2 days of learning that this was a serious outbreak. And that saved countless lives. What we didn't know at the time, and I, by the way, after cutting off travel from China, I called my counterparts, the other national security advisors in Europe, and urged them to take similar action. What we didn't realize is the Chinese would continue to allow folks to travel from Wuhan. Even though they'd cut off travel within China, they allowed those folks to travel from China to Europe and to seed the disease in Europe and then have it come through a back door into the United States. So look, in hindsight, perfect hindsight, when we realized the Europeans hadn't cut off travel, and when we and we didn't know at the time, but we've later learned that the Chinese allowed folks to continue to travel from Wuhan to Europe. Sure, it would have been better to cut it off early, but what I want to focus on are literally the hundreds of thousands or millions of lives that were saved because President Trump made a decision that was entirely courageous at a time when the IC and others did not believe that this was a serious health risk or even a global pandemic.
The president has said that he wouldn't shut down the country again if there's a second wave of this virus. The two could overlap, a resurgence and the elections. What planning are you doing? Are you setting up infrastructure for mail-in ballots?
Well, we have a very strong infrastructure at the NSC on elections, both for election interference, which is the physical attack on the infrastructure, whether it's and working with DHS and working with all the agencies, FBI, the IC, the physical attacks on the sanctity of the election day, the ballots, the voting machines, the Secretary of State websites. And we're also looking and have a group that's focused on election interference. We'll have to see what happens with the virus, but we want to make sure that we have a free and a fair election. That election is going to take place on Election Day. There's no question about it. And we want to make sure that Americans can go to the polls safely, and we'll do everything we can to make sure that happens. At the same time, we want to avoid voter fraud and misapprehension about the safety of the election among the American people.
Well, mail-in ballots may be a necessity in terms of where we are health-wise in this country. What planning are you doing now to prepare us for the fall? Have you stockpiled protective gear? Are you considering stockpiling drugs like remdesivir?
Well, we're working to produce as much remdesivir as possible, and the company Gilead that's behind it has been doing a great job. It's an American success story. We're going to have a stockpile, excuse me, of over 100,000 ventilators that are available, and we're stockpiling PPE. We're making masks. The president's been to several companies that are now domestically producing masks, so we're not dependent on the Chinese Communist Party for our PPE. So we're moving out smartly on all those fronts, Margaret.
If China develops a vaccine before the U.S. does, would it be made available to the American public?
Well, listen, I think we're going to develop a vaccine first. Now, there's a chance, and it's been reported, that the Chinese have been engaged in espionage to try and find the research and the technologies that we're working on, both for a vaccine and a therapy. So, look, they've got a many-year history of stealing American intellectual property and knocking off American technology, and I wouldn't be surprised if they did that with the vaccines. But I think we're moving out very quickly on both therapies and a vaccine. We're going to make it available to the American people, and one of the things the president said is if we have a vaccine, we're going to share it with the whole world. Look, this was a virus that was unleashed by China. There was a cover-up that someday they're going to do an HBO show like they did with Chernobyl on this virus. But we're going to be part of the solution to the virus. Oh, a cover-up of the virus. I mean, the Chinese knew this was happening in November, December, January, and we're giving false information to the WHO.
Local authorities, or are you accusing Beijing?
Well, look, we don't know because they kicked out all the reporters and they wouldn't let CDC investigators come in, and they're still stonewalling an investigation. So we don't know who in the Chinese government did it, but it doesn't matter if it was a local Chinese government or the Communist Party of China. This is a real problem, and it cost many thousands of lives in America and around the world because the real information was not allowed to get out, and it was a cover-up, and we'll get to the bottom of it eventually. But it's hard to do in a communist closed society. It's hard to get to the bottom of what happened.
Ambassador O'Brien, thank you for your time this morning.